In the quiet stillness of Hollywood's golden past, certain names shimmer eternally: Bogart, Hepburn, Gable. And then there are those that fade, not from lack of brilliance, but perhaps from the complicated shadows they cast. Walter Brennan, once the most decorated supporting actor of his era, held a record few could match: 3 Academy Awards in just 5 years. He was a fixture in westerns, a familiar face on television, and a voice that carried both warmth and grit. Yet today, his name is rarely spoken alongside the greats. What happened to Walter Brennan? Once celebrated for his rustic charm and uncanny ability to disappear into a role, Brennan's on-screen persona was that of the kindly grandfather, the wise old-timer, or the dependable sidekick. He was a character actor of the highest order, someone whose presence lent texture and authenticity to every film he touched. But off-camera, a different story was unfolding. A story that reveals not just the rise and fall of a Hollywood star, but the complex man behind the curtain, a man shaped by war, driven by conviction, and eventually isolated by belief. Born at the tail end of the 19th century, Brennan lived through world wars, the Great Depression, the rise of television, and the social revolutions of the 1960s. His career mirrored the transformation of Hollywood itself, from the silent films of the 1920s to the Technicolor epics of the 1950s and the small-screen sitcoms that followed. For decades, he was a constant, a reassuring presence in an industry defined by reinvention. And yet, as the world changed around him, Brennan clung ever more tightly to the values of a disappearing America. There is a reason Walter Brennan remains both revered and reviled. His performances continue to move audiences: his portrayal of Judge Roy Bean in The Westerner, his fatherly warmth in The Real McCoys, the melancholy lyricism of Old Rivers. But behind those roles stood a man whose worldview became increasingly rigid, and whose private declarations often stood in painful contrast to the tenderness of his art. As we delve into his life, we'll uncover a tale marked by humble beginnings, unexpected success, and a professional legacy unmatched by many of his peers. But we'll also explore the deeply unsettling beliefs that came to define his later years, beliefs that have complicated his memory and left his legacy forever contested. Walter Brennan was not simply a relic of old Hollywood. He was a mirror of his time, full of talent, contradictions, and fierce convictions. To understand him is to confront both the wonder and the discomfort of an era that shaped American entertainment and American identity. This is the story of Walter Brennan, as it was lived, brilliant, troubling, and, in the end, undeniably human. Long before the cameras rolled and the golden statuettes gleamed, Walter Brennan was simply a boy named Walter Andrew, born on July 25th, 1894, in the industrial town of Lynn, Massachusetts. His parents, Irish immigrants seeking better opportunities, raised their children with discipline, humility, and the enduring hope of upward mobility. Walter's father worked as an engineer, precise, mechanical, logical, and he imagined much the same future for his son. The family settled in the seaside community of Swampscott, where young Walter's days were filled with structure and quiet aspirations. There was little in Brennan's early years to suggest that he would one day become a fixture of American cinema. He was not the sort of child who demanded the spotlight. Instead, he absorbed the world around him, watching, listening, mimicking the voices and mannerisms of the adults he admired. Even then, there was a performer in him, though it would take time before he allowed it to take center stage. His father enrolled him at Ring Technical School in Cambridge, a respected preparatory academy for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Engineering was the goal, and Walter dutifully pursued it. He passed his courses, learned the calculations, and attended classes with the quiet resolve expected of him. But within the structured walls of Ring, something else began to stir. An extracurricular acting club captured his imagination. He found himself drawn to its energy, to the thrill of stepping into another life, even if only for a few fleeting minutes on stage. Walter later recalled how his thoughts would drift in class, not to the formulas on the board, but to the lines he had to memorize for the next amateur play. "I passed all my regular subjects," he said, "but more and more I found my thoughts occupied by that extracurricular activity of mine, the acting club." It was a gentle rebellion, but a rebellion nonetheless. Still, he kept his ambitions quiet, particularly from his father, whose dreams of his son becoming an engineer seemed too sacred to disturb. But history had its own plans. In 1917, the United States entered the Great War, and like so many of his generation, Walter put his personal dreams on hold. He enlisted in the army, serving with the 101st Field Artillery Regiment in France. The experience would change him, not just as a man, but as an actor, though he could not have known it at the time. During his service, Brennan was exposed to mustard gas. The damage to his vocal cords was significant, and though the injury brought pain and difficulty, it also left him with something singular, a high-pitched, gravelly voice that no other actor possessed. It would later become one of his most defining traits, an accidental gift from the battlefield. As the war came to an end and Walter returned to American soil, he faced an uncertain future. His youthful aspirations had not disappeared. If anything, they had grown stronger. But the path ahead was far from clear. What he did not yet realize was that this combination of modest roots, wartime endurance, and a quiet, persistent yearning to perform would set the stage for one of the most unlikely rises in Hollywood history. When Walter Brennan returned from the battlefields of France, he carried with him more than memories of the Great War. The mustard gas that had scorched his lungs and throat had left an indelible mark. His once unremarkable voice now bore a rasp, thin and high-pitched, with a peculiar tremble that seemed to catch in the air. To most, it might have been a lifelong affliction. For Walter, it became an unexpected signature. Still, the voice alone did not promise a future. In the years following the war, Brennan's life was scattered with odd jobs and quiet disappointments. He worked as a financial reporter, a lumberjack, a ditch digger, even a bank messenger. There was little glamour in these occupations, only the steady grind of trying to find one's place in a country still adjusting to peace. Eventually, he turned to real estate, an industry that, for a brief moment, offered him a taste of prosperity. But it was fleeting. The real estate crash of 1925 wiped away his earnings, just as he had begun to find his footing. Faced with dwindling options and a family to support, Brennan contemplated a radical shift, moving to Guatemala to try his hand at pineapple farming. It was a plan born more of desperation than desire. But fate, or perhaps intuition, intervened in the form of a suggestion from a friend. Why not try Hollywood? The idea seemed unlikely. Brennan was in his 30s, far past the age of starry-eyed newcomers. Yet something stirred in him, a faint echo of those school plays and amateur performances back in Massachusetts. Acting had always lingered in the background, and now, with so little to lose, it stepped forward again. Encouraged by his fiancée, Ruth Wells, Walter mustered the courage to speak the dream aloud. The reaction was less than enthusiastic. Ruth's father disapproved, not only of the idea but of the union itself. Yet Walter and Ruth were undeterred. With defiance softened by love, they married and set out for California in an aging touring car, their belongings rattling in the back, their future uncertain. There's a story Brennan often told, how, during the drive westward, a sudden wind tore the top from their car in the midst of a rainstorm. Unfazed, Ruth opened an umbrella through the rip in the roof and held it steady while they continued driving through the downpour. It was a simple act, but it captured something essential about the life they were choosing: resilience, humor, and a willingness to keep going, even when the road was falling apart. When they finally reached California, the reality of Hollywood was sobering. The city teemed with hopefuls, and the gates to the studios were guarded by silence. Brennan stood in casting lines, shuffled through crowds of extras, and waited for something, anything, that might break the monotony of rejection. In those early days, he met another aspiring actor named Gary Cooper. They were both nobodies then, just two men leaning on studio walls, swapping stories, and sharing the weight of ambition. For Brennan, the path forward wouldn't come through charm or leading man looks. It would come through something far stranger, an uncanny ability to bray like a donkey. In a moment of frustration at a casting call, he offered to mimic the sound for a group struggling to coax a real donkey into performing. His imitation was so perfect, so absurdly convincing, that he was hired on the spot. That moment, as unlikely as it was, marked the true beginning of his film career. Walter Brennan had found his entry not through elegance or refinement, but through instinct, timing, and a rare willingness to make a fool of himself when the moment called for it. He wasn't yet a star, but he was inside the gates, and for the first time, Hollywood was paying attention. Hollywood in the 1920s was a dream in motion. Silent pictures flickered to life, studio lots buzzed with promise, and hopeful actors lined the sidewalks like extras in their own unwritten stories. Walter Brennan was one of them. Though older than most newcomers and hardly the image of a matinee idol, he had something more valuable: persistence, character, and the humility to start at the very bottom. His earliest roles were bling-ken-you'll-miss-it affairs. He played uncredited parts in dozens of films, often standing in the background, walking across a street, or reacting wordlessly to another actor's lines. It was thankless work, but Walter accepted it without complaint. He was learning the rhythms of the set, the etiquette of the camera, and the unspoken hierarchy of the studio system. With each appearance, he absorbed the craft around him, quietly, steadily, without fanfare. Brennan's breakthrough came not through a single moment, but through an accumulation of small ones. His willingness to take on odd or unglamorous parts caught the attention of directors looking for reliable character actors. He was adaptable, able to play both older and younger roles thanks to a trick he would come to perfect, removing his dentures to age himself on screen. His accident on set, whether the result of a stunt gone wrong or a mule's unexpected kick, had knocked out most of his front teeth. Instead of wallowing in misfortune, Walter turned it into a calling card. He became known for a peculiar question he would ask when offered a role: with or without? Directors, puzzled, would reply, without what? And Brennan, with a grin, would pop out his false teeth to reveal a toothless smile that instantly aged him by 20 years. The transformation was startling and, in Hollywood terms, profitable. In a town obsessed with youth, Walter cornered the market on age. His earliest credited appearances came in films like Webs of Steel and Lorraine of the Lions, but it was a minor role in The Wedding Night that first caught the eye of producer Samuel Goldwyn. Though Brennan played nothing more than a taxi driver, something in his presence lingered. Goldwyn saw what others had missed, a performer who brought authenticity to even the smallest part. That same year, Brennan secured a more substantial role in Barbary Coast, directed by Howard Hawks. It was the beginning of a fruitful partnership, one that would stretch across multiple films and showcase Brennan's range as a performer. He played eccentrics and villains, sidekicks and sages, always imbuing them with a lived-in truth that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the script. Yet even with this progress, Brennan's name was rarely in the headlines. He remained a fixture in the background, reliable, indispensable, and, for a time, anonymous. But those around him noticed. Directors knew he could elevate a scene, even without a line of dialogue. Fellow actors admired his lack of ego, and audiences, though they may not have known his name, began to recognize his face. In 1936, the tide turned dramatically. His performance as the Swedish lumberman Swan Bostrom in Come and Get It was earthy, emotional, and unforgettable. It earned him the very first Academy Award ever given for Best Supporting Actor, a newly created category that seemed tailor-made for talents like his. Suddenly, Walter Brennan was no longer an extra. He was a name, an asset, a star in his own right. As Hollywood grew glossier and more glamorous, Walter Brennan stood apart. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, nor did he possess the baritone voice or leading man presence so often idolized on screen. But what he had, an unmatched ability to transform himself completely, was far rarer. And curiously, it all hinged on a single unfortunate accident. By most accounts, the incident occurred during a stunt on set, though details vary. Some say he was kicked by a mule. Others claim it was during an action scene gone wrong. Whatever the cause, Brennan lost most of his front teeth. A painful injury for anyone, but a potential career ender for a man hoping to work in front of a camera. Yet, in a twist that only Hollywood could script, the loss of those teeth became his greatest advantage. With the removal of his dentures, Brennan could appear decades older, his face collapsing into the weariness and fragility of age. At a time when casting directors scrambled to find actors who could convincingly play grizzled old men, Walter didn't need hours in a makeup chair. He simply slipped his dentures into his pocket and stepped into character. It was a trick he wielded with surprising humor. Upon being cast, he would often ask directors, with or without, a cryptic phrase until, with a toothless grin, the transformation was made clear. This single trait, paired with his natural ability to inhabit the mannerisms of the elderly, catapulted Brennan into a unique category. He wasn't just a supporting actor. He became Hollywood's go-to for the wise, the cantankerous, the lovable, and sometimes sinister old men that filled out the heart of so many classic stories. While others competed for youth, Walter made his mark on age. He began securing roles that took advantage of this distinct quality. His presence lent gravitas and emotional depth to films, even when he wasn't the focus of the story. Audiences believed him because Brennan disappeared into his characters so completely. He wasn't playing old men. He became them, shuffling across dusty porches, grumbling in backrooms, offering sage advice or well-timed comic relief. There was something profoundly human in the way he approached age, and it resonated. His role in The Wedding Night opened doors, but it was Barbary Coast that positioned him as a force within the studio system. He played the eccentric character Old Atrocity, a supporting part that nonetheless lingered in the audience's memory long after the credits rolled. It marked the first of many collaborations with director Howard Hawks, who understood Brennan's rare gift and used it to its fullest effect. And then came the film that would change everything, Come and Get It. Brennan's portrayal of Swan Bostrom, a gentle, aging Swedish lumberman, was not merely convincing, it was revelatory. The performance was tender, lived in, and heartbreakingly real. It earned him not just acclaim, but history. At the first ceremony to include the Best Supporting Actor category, Walter Brennan walked away with the award. And just like that, he became more than a reliable extra. He was a recognized master of his craft. The Academy would call his name 2 more times in the years that followed. For Kentucky in 1938 and The Westerner in 1940, Brennan took home additional Oscars, making him the first, and still one of the only, actors to win 3 Academy Awards for supporting roles. It was a feat that stunned Hollywood and cemented his place in its lore. Walter Brennan had done what few others could. Without the trappings of leading man charm, he had carved out a singular space in film history, one toothless grin at a time. In a town built on illusion, accolades are both currency and myth. For Walter Brennan, the shimmering glow of the Academy Awards came not once, but 3 times in just 5 years, a feat that, even by modern standards, borders on the unbelievable. His first Oscar, awarded for Come and Get It in 1936, was received with admiration. His second, for Kentucky in 1938, raised eyebrows. And by the time he collected his third, for The Westerner in 1940, Hollywood had begun to murmur. In those early years of the Academy, the process was still evolving, its rules not yet hardened by precedent. The Best Supporting Actor category itself had only just been introduced, and Brennan, already seasoned by a dozen small but impactful roles, seemed the natural candidate. He brought depth, consistency, and authenticity to his characters. His performances, never grandiose, carried a quiet power that stuck with audiences long after the final frame. But 3 wins? In such rapid succession? For a supporting player, no less? Questions inevitably surfaced. Had Brennan benefited from more than talent? Behind the scenes, a curious detail began to emerge, one that cast a different light on his meteoric rise. At the time, members of the Extras Union were allowed to vote in the Academy Awards. It was an era when the lines between stardom and studio rank were more fluid, and Brennan, who had begun his career as an extra, had maintained strong relationships within that close-knit community. Word spread that Brennan was immensely popular among the extras. He treated them with kindness, respected their work, and never forgot where he came from. Whether through camaraderie, loyalty, or admiration, many extras had cast their ballots for him. Not once, but multiple times. It was a groundswell of support that may well have tipped the scales in his favor. The Academy took notice. After Brennan's third win, they quietly revised the rules. Extras would no longer be permitted to vote. The change was subtle but significant, and its timing left little room for doubt. Though no wrongdoing was ever proven, the implication lingered that Brennan's victories, while not unearned, might have been helped along by a particularly devoted block of supporters. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. Brennan had become a figure of rare distinction. In a profession dominated by leading men and marquee names, he had risen to the very top of his field by playing characters few others dared to portray. And despite the whispers, his place in history was secured. Still, the glow of the Oscars faded faster than expected. After the rule change, Brennan was nominated just once more for Sergeant York and did not win. Whether it was a shift in Academy politics, a change in public taste, or simply the end of a remarkable streak, his days as an award season fixture came to a close. Yet Brennan did not appear troubled by this. He had never courted fame for its own sake, and he rarely spoke about his trophies. To him, the work mattered more than the applause. As he once said, "I never wanted to be a star. I just wanted to be a good actor." In that, he had already succeeded. As the film industry entered the 1950s, the glimmer of the silver screen began to share space with the warm glow of the television set. For many seasoned actors, this shift was unsettling, a step down, a compromise. But Walter Brennan, ever pragmatic and fond of steady work, saw it differently. Where others hesitated, he adapted. And in doing so, he embarked on a new chapter that would define him for a generation of American families. His initial reluctance to commit to a television series gave way when he was offered the role of Grandpa Amos in The Real McCoys. At first glance, it seemed an unassuming part, an elderly patriarch guiding his family from the hills of West Virginia to a California farm. But Brennan, with his unmistakable voice and weathered charm, turned Amos McCoy into more than just a character. He made him an icon. The series premiered in 1957 and quickly struck a chord with audiences. It ran for 6 successful seasons, 5 on ABC and 1 final year on CBS, with Brennan appearing in over 200 episodes. He embraced the medium with enthusiasm, relishing the regular schedule and familiar cast. "I'd rather do television than movies," he once remarked, because there aren't any long layoffs between working days. He liked the rhythm, the structure, the certainty of it all. "By Sunday night," he said with a smile, "I can hardly wait to get started on Monday morning." But Brennan was not content to simply perform. During the Real McCoys, he partnered with the show's creator, Irving Pincus, to form Brennan Westgate Productions, a venture that allowed him more creative control and a share in the profits. It was a quiet reminder that behind the toothless grins and rustic roles was a man of considerable business acumen. Television also introduced Brennan to new audiences who may never have seen Come and Get It or The Westerner. To children and young families, he was Grandpa Amos, cantankerous but lovable, gruff but kind-hearted. The role softened his public image, and for many, it became the defining face of Walter Brennan. His characters on screen were deeply rooted in traditional values: family, hard work, and common sense. And in an era of cultural upheaval, that familiar simplicity felt reassuring. Yet Brennan's artistic reach extended beyond television. In an unexpected turn, he ventured into music, specifically a genre-spanning blend of country and spoken word. In 1962, he recorded Old Rivers, a nostalgic tale of an old farmer and his mule. Delivered in Brennan's cracked, trembling voice, the song struck a poignant chord with listeners. To the surprise of many, it climbed to number 5 on the Billboard chart, making Brennan, then in his late 60s, the oldest living person to have a top 40 hit at the time. The song's success led to more recordings, including Mama Sang a Song, which also charted. Brennan didn't sing so much as recite, but there was something in the delivery, plain spoken, sincere, that resonated. He spoke like someone's grandfather recounting tales by a crackling fire, and in that simplicity lay its power. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Brennan continued to work steadily in both film and television. He appeared in Rio Bravo alongside John Wayne and Dean Martin, a reminder that his cinematic roots still ran deep. He lent his voice to animated projects, judged musical competitions on Jukebox Jury, and starred in various anthology series that showcased his versatility. Whether in black and white westerns or family-friendly serials, Brennan never strayed far from the public eye. By all appearances, he had achieved a rare balance, beloved by audiences, respected by colleagues, and creatively fulfilled. His presence on screen was as constant and comforting as the turning of the seasons. But behind the scenes, a different Walter Brennan was beginning to emerge, one shaped not just by tradition, but by fear, suspicion, and beliefs that would come to cast a long shadow over his legacy. For much of his career, Walter Brennan's public image was that of a warm-hearted elder, wise, humble, and steeped in old-fashioned decency. To the millions who watched The Real McCoys, he was Grandpa Amos, a pillar of family values, never far from a lesson wrapped in a story. But as the 1960s progressed and the country grappled with profound social and political upheaval, Brennan's private views began to surface, and they bore little resemblance to the gentle figure he portrayed on screen. Off camera, Brennan was fiercely conservative, but more than that, he held views that many found not only extreme, but troublingly hostile. He spoke openly about his suspicion of the civil rights movement, believing it to be less about justice and more about communist subversion. To him, the marches in Birmingham, the sit-ins, the protests, these were not the voices of the oppressed, but the workings of a foreign conspiracy. He did not whisper these thoughts. He expressed them with the same conviction and clarity he brought to his characters. The disconnect between Brennan's public persona and his private beliefs became impossible to ignore. Colleagues recalled moments that left them stunned. According to reports, Brennan openly rejoiced upon hearing of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, a reaction that many found not just callous, but horrifying. For those who had admired his characters, who had invited his likeness into their homes week after week, this revelation felt like betrayal. Even those closest to Brennan struggled to reconcile the contrast. Writers and cast members from The Real McCoys, including Everett Greenbaum, who penned dozens of episodes, later described Brennan as deeply bigoted. He often made derogatory remarks about Black Americans, and his disdain for the era's social changes was not just political, it was personal, bitter, and unrelenting. Brennan believed that the civil unrest in cities like Watts and Newark wasn't born of inequality or desperation, but rather incited by agitators seeking to destabilize the nation. He dismissed legitimate grievances as manufactured outrage, manipulated by what he referred to as a Marxist agenda. When asked about the riots, he reportedly suggested that they could have been quelled with machine guns, a comment so chilling, so devoid of empathy, that even those familiar with his beliefs were taken aback. As the years wore on, Brennan doubled down rather than retreating from these views. He became affiliated with the John Birch Society, a far-right organization known for its hardline opposition to civil rights and perceived communist threats. At a convention, he recorded speeches in the familiar cadence of Grandpa Amos, using his trusted voice to deliver messages steeped in fear and division. This stark divide between the man and the persona left many wondering which was real. Was Grandpa Amos merely a role? Was the warmth and wisdom just performance? Or could both parts of Brennan, his tender on-screen presence and his deeply unsettling convictions, exist side by side in one complicated man? The questions multiplied, and for many fans, so did the discomfort. How could someone capable of such nuanced, heartfelt performances hold views so rigid, so dehumanizing? As Brennan's comments became more widely known, they reshaped how audiences viewed his work. His legacy, once defined by cinematic achievement, began to carry the weight of his personal ideology. And yet, he never seemed to flinch under scrutiny. If anything, he stood more firmly by his beliefs, convinced that he saw the world as it truly was. It was a conviction that hardened into something more than conservatism. It became dogma, and it would soon lead him further down a path of paranoia and isolation. As the final chapters of Walter Brennan's life unfolded, the gentle illusion of Grandpa Amos grew harder to sustain. Beneath the kind-eyed characters he portrayed, a different man had begun to take shape, one gripped by fear, suspicion, and an unwavering belief that America was slipping away from the values he held dear. By the late 1960s and early 70s, Brennan's worldview had narrowed, his outlook darkened. He was no longer simply a man with strong opinions. He was, in many ways, preparing for war. The same voice that once recited tender lyrics in old rivers now echoed through speeches for political candidates known for their extreme ideologies. Brennan, who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Hollywood's brightest stars, now aligned himself with figures like George Wallace and John Schmitz, men who stood far to the right of the mainstream conservative movement. In 1972, he even chaired Schmitz's finance committee, lending both his name and his public image to the campaign. To those who remembered Brennan's roles in heartwarming tales of family and community, the transformation was jarring. But his political affiliations were only the surface of a much deeper shift. Brennan became increasingly convinced that the United States stood on the brink of collapse. He believed communists were infiltrating the government, schools, even the entertainment industry. In his mind, the country's moral fabric was unraveling. Its youth corrupted by rock music, its values eroded by social change. And so, while many of his peers enjoyed quiet retirements or reflective memoirs, Brennan made other preparations. At his estate in Los Angeles, Brennan commissioned the construction of a private bunker. This was no modest storm shelter. Stocked with firearms, canned goods, water supplies, and emergency rations, it was designed for long-term survival. Brennan believed a Soviet invasion was imminent, and he intended to be ready. The very ground beneath his home became a fortress, a symbol of how deeply he feared the world around him. His paranoia extended beyond geopolitics. Within his own family, Brennan laid down unusual rules. He once instructed his daughter to forbid her children from listening to the Beatles, fearing their music would lead to moral decay. To Brennan, even a simple melody could be a harbinger of cultural collapse. The modern world felt foreign to him, not just confusing but threatening, and rather than adapt, he chose to wall himself off from it entirely. Seeking further distance from what he saw as a crumbling society, Brennan purchased the 120,000-acre Lightning Creek Ranch in remote Oregon. It became more than a retreat. It was a self-contained world. On the property, he built a movie theater, a general store, and the Indian Lodge Motel. Here, far from the growing cities and changing tides, he created a sanctuary that reflected the America he remembered, or at least the one he wanted to preserve. Even in professional settings, Brennan's worldview colored his interactions. Co-stars and crew members recalled him quizzing them on their political affiliations. Those who admitted to voting for Democrats were met with lengthy lectures about the downfall of civilization. What might have once been idle chatter turned into zealous monologues, rooted not in debate, but in dire warnings of collapse and revolution. It was a strange endgame for a man who had spent decades as one of Hollywood's most beloved character actors. Where others softened with age, Brennan seemed to harden. His convictions grew sharper, his fear deeper. And yet, even as he isolated himself with bunkers, land, and ideologies, he continued to work, perhaps clinging to the familiar routine of performance as the last tether to the world he once knew. Walter Brennan's name once lit up theater marquees and television screens across America. For decades, he was a fixture in the lives of audiences, a dependable presence who brought humor, wisdom, and humanity to every role he touched. He was the lovable curmudgeon, the kind-hearted grandfather, the unshakable ranch hand, never the star at the center of the frame, but always the soul of the story. With 3 Academy Awards, over 200 film appearances, and a television legacy that defined an era, Brennan carved out a career few could rival. But behind that well-worn face and weathered voice lay a man of deep contradictions. While his characters inspired warmth and nostalgia, his real-life beliefs evoked discomfort and disillusionment. His rise from humble beginnings, through the trials of war and the uncertainty of Hollywood, reflected a uniquely American story. Yet his later years revealed another narrative altogether, one driven by fear, hardened ideology, and a bitter resistance to the world's inevitable evolution. It is tempting to draw a line between the man and the roles he played, to remember Grandpa Amos without recalling the man who championed George Wallace, to celebrate Come and get it without acknowledging the bunker beneath his home. But history rarely allows such neat separations. Brennan's artistry and his ideology lived side by side, each shaping how he moved through the world and how the world now remembers him. His contributions to cinema remain undeniable. He helped define the role of the character actor, proving that greatness on screen didn't require a leading role or a chiseled jawline. He showed that authenticity, timing, and subtlety could move an audience as deeply as any monologue or dramatic close-up. His work, especially in westerns and family dramas, continues to inspire actors who study his performances not for their glamour, but for their honesty. And yet, the shadow of his personal views lingers. For many, it casts doubt over the sincerity of his most heartfelt roles. How could a man who portrayed such tenderness speak with such cruelty? How can we reconcile his legacy with the pain caused by his beliefs? These are not questions with easy answers. They require a reckoning, not just with Brennan's story, but with the larger question of how we remember our cultural icons when the spotlight dims and the full picture comes into view. In the end, Walter Brennan was a man of great complexity. He left behind a legacy of performances that shaped the fabric of American film and television, but also a legacy of personal convictions that many found deeply troubling. His life, like the country he loved and feared in equal measure, was marked by both greatness and contradiction. To honor that legacy is not to look away, but to look fully, to see the artist and the man, the accolades and the ideology, the charm and the challenge. For in understanding Walter Brennan's story, we come closer to understanding the uneasy tension between fame and truth, and the legacy we leave behind when the final curtain falls. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of Hollywood's golden era.